All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, June 7th of 2022. Thanks for tuning into the stream here today. If this is your first time watching Office Hours, this is a live open Q&A style show where I answer questions from the SaberSim community about how to use SaberSim, about how to build better DFS lineups, really whatever you guys want to talk about. If you have questions you'd like me to answer on this show, you can email us, support@sabersim.com. You can fire away live here in the YouTube chat as we go through today. And you can ask your questions in the Office Hours channel in our Slack community. And if you haven't already joined our Slack community, get joined up in there. There's a link to join in the description of every past Office Hours show. If you have watched this show before, welcome back. We are in the new digs here. The move was completed successfully over the weekend here with only minor speed bumps. At least feels that way on the other side. Obviously have a lot of unpacking here still to do. We're in the new office here. Looking pretty good. Let me know what you guys think. We need to get some things up on the walls here. I think over the next couple weeks, maybe want to spruce the room up a little bit. Walls looking a little bare, but have a lot more room here to work with, which is pretty nice. I did have to move some things around from how I was set up at the old office, which was really just my living room. So if there are any technical issues on the stream here today, obviously this is our first one in the new spot. So if you guys are having any issues here, or hearing any issues or seeing any issues with the stream, just let me know. We'll get those worked out. We moved the camera angle too. I don't know if any of you guys have picked up on that. So you guys are finally getting to see my good side. Anyway, let's go ahead and dive into it here today. Because we skipped yesterday over here, we have a lot of questions in the queue. So we've got a lot to talk about, a lot to walk through, a lot to dive into. But if you have questions for me, feel free to fire away. I'm going to do my best here to get to every single question that came in over the weekend and yesterday before we jump in here today. But if you have questions, go ahead and fire away. Let's get the app pulled up here. And let's go ahead and do this here. Before we get started, I did want to call out the stream we did at the end of last week. I pinned that here in a couple spots. At the end of this new here, start here first, play these GPPs to maximize your DFS profits. And then also down here in the Office Hours playlist, I had Eric on talking about all the hard work he has been doing this past month, I guess, researching contest selection. And we also unveiled, I guess, our new contest selection framework. Includes basically mixing up what we're calling diversifier contests, which are 20 max and 150 max contests where you can get a lot of unique lineups in play and smooth out your variance, and elevator contests, which are going to be the high effective entrance, single entry and 3 max contests where you can have a really big ROI and have the opportunity to really get those big boosts in your bankroll when you hit the right lineup in those right kinds of contests. So if we have some content, I think we have some contest selection questions here today. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. But check out those videos if you haven't seen them already, or check out that video if you haven't seen it already, because Eric worked really hard on that contest selection research, and we had a great conversation there on Friday of last week talking about that. So anyway, let's go ahead and get into some questions here and start answering some questions. I want to start with a few that came in via email over the weekend, and they are both, I believe, kind of late swap type questions here. So let's go ahead and get into this one first here. And this question says, I have a hypothetical question. Suppose there is a slate of 6 games or less, and the game with the highest implied run total, according to Vegas, is postponed an hour before game time. Earlier than that, you built 150 max lineups. SaberSim loved 4-4 and 5-3 stacks, and 25% of your 150 entries had players from those teams. Do you go to DK, edit entries, upload to SaberSim, and hit the lightning bolt button, or do another build? And if you do another build, because now there's a huge power shift within the field, for lack of a better way to put it, curious how Coach Jay approaches this. Yeah, so I guess it kind of depends a little bit on when this happens. I mean, the dream here would be that this happens before lock. So let's say, it's tonight's slate. We have a 13-game slate. I know before anybody mentions it here, I know we have a weird game time here for this Texas and Cleveland doubleheader going on. We'll get that fixed as the day goes along. But yeah, I mean, so let's say, let's say you've built your lineups, you're all set, and then we get news here that, some random game on the slate is postponed. The dream is that it's before lock. If it's before lock, 100% of the time, I would be rebuilding my lineups from scratch. I would start with a brand new build. I would go in here, I'd set my settings, and I'd rebuild exactly for the reasons that you've described, right? That a game getting postponed changes the slate dynamics quite a bit. Especially if it's a very popular game, which it sounds like in this hypothetical it is, for one reason or another. So I would want to rebuild after those, I guess after that game gets marked out, get those players out of your lineups, but also give yourself an opportunity to shift things around and take advantage of all of that up-to-date information that you get when a game gets postponed. Now, if it's after lock and you have players from other games already in lineups, it does get a little bit more complicated. I think to start with, I would probably still start with a quick swap using this red lightning bolt here to get all the players that are out of my lineups, right? At the very least, you don't want to be left with a 0. So I would probably start there. But after that, I think I would go in and run a full late swap build. So I would go in, I would again do the build lineups button, but I would make sure I was doing a late swap build, and I would rebuild those lineups using the late swap here tool, right? And again, I think that is only in a situation where a game gets totally postponed. And that's just because I'm trying to take advantage of that information as much as possible, right? If you, let's say, for example, you've got a Rays 5 stack in a lineup, and then actually that's a bad example because they play in the Trop, right? We'll pick a game that's outdoors, right? Maybe this Minnesota game. So maybe you got Yankees 5 stacks, for example, and then this game gets postponed. Well, if you use the quick swap and swap to the next best available player, those Yankee stacks are just going to dissolve into nothings. They're going to dissolve into random assortments of the highest overall projected players, which is good if you're in an emergency and need to get a playable lineup in play really quickly. But I would rather rebuild using the late swap tool, taking advantage of correlation and finding a new stack to put in there instead, which is what the late swap tool would do. So anyway, interesting hypothetical there. A lot of times I would say in actuality, I don't end up in those kinds of situations all too often, because most of the time I'm pretty conservative with handling weather in baseball DFS. I generally don't take a lot of risks there, and if a game has a pretty good chance of postponing, I'm generally off of it pretty early, just because there are a lot of other places to go. So, and then there's another kind of follow up here with swapping, and we'll hit this one real quick. So the follow-up question says, when swapping in baseball, should I choose best player available or another player from the same team? And I copied I copied Ruben's message when he sent this over to me too. So it sounds like Ruben answered some of the other questions here that this person had in our customer service platform. So anyway, but the main question here, is it better to swap with best player available or best player from the same team? I think let's go ahead. Let's get my entries file in here and get some lineups in so I can actually start showing some of this stuff in practice here. So I've got my entries file here loaded up. This is my $101 contest portfolio here, using that new contest selection framework here. So you can see my elevator contest, my diversifier contest. It's all looking good. It's feeling good. You can see I put in a placeholder earlier today, and it looks like I have a player that's out. So question, should I use all out, or should I swap with best available or best available from same team? For baseball, assuming that you are swapping hitters, I almost always prefer to do best from the same team, because it's going to keep intact all of your stacks, right? Let's actually get real lineups in here instead of a placeholder. Let's do 150 real quick. I want to get real lineups in here and then demo this of actually how I'd use this. But I ultimately what I'm going to do is generally prefer to use best available from same team, because it will keep intact those correlations and those stacks, right? Generally, there's not enough of a fantasy point sacrifice that you have to make to swap into a player that's the best available from the same team. And I think it's worth it. I think that trade-off, getting that correlation and maybe trading a fantasy point of projection, is almost always worth it to me. Like, what I'm basically saying, Actually, let's look at instead of me trying to just explain this, let's look at a very specific example here because I think it'll make it a little more clear what I'm referring to here. So let's give these lineups just a moment to wrap up here, and we'll talk about this here. Okay, so we have our lineups here, and let's do this, and it looks like we're into Toronto stacks. So give this just a moment to get caught up here, just so I can fill these lineups. Okay, great. Now we're in business, and we'll fill. And I'm going to do unique random, and we'll fill, and we'll download. Okay, and those are our lineups. So now let's go back over here, and let's pretend, hypothetically, that Vlad Guerrero Jr. gets ruled out, right? Okay, so not in the lineup, Vlad Guerrero Jr., right? This thing's red now. You click this, no Vlad Guerrero Jr., right? So he plays first base, right? So there are, if we did swap with the next best available, it would probably swap to like Freeman, Goldschmidt, Hoskins, right? All of these guys. I would rather swap as many as possible. So let's say it's Biggio instead, right? And he's projected for 7.5. So hypothetical there, right? I'm willing to generally sacrifice like the 1 point, the 1.25 points, the maybe 2 points maximum here, and play Biggio to maintain correlation here instead of just swapping to Freddie Freeman or Goldschmidt or Hoskins. So what I typically end up doing is I will go in here and swap from the best available from the same team first. I will always try to do that first. And in this case, we were able to do that swap in all 44 lineups. If we weren't able to do it in all 44, then I would follow that up by doing the next best available players, finishing there, and then downloading my entries. Right. So I'll basically say swap as many of these as you can swap as many of these as possible with the best available player from the same team. And then after that, swap in some other uncorrelated player. So good question. All right, let's keep it rolling. Let's keep it going here. And okay, going to jump over to a few questions from Coach B. These came in over the weekend. This is about kind of contest selection, I guess, and also filling contests. So he said, if I'm making multiple entries into one contest, how should I set my builds? For example, 42 total lineups along 4 contests for MMA tonight. Apologize, Coach B, that I couldn't get to this sooner. I hope you ended up doing okay with MMA, but said total of 77,000 lineups between the 4 contests, 2 single entries, a 20 max, and a 150 max. I want to spread my risk and use unique lineups. Should I build my SaberSim entries with an entry limit of 150, an entrance at 50,000, or 4 different SaberSim builds for single entry, 20 entry, and 150, all different entrance sizes? Then this runs the risk of having multiple of the same lineups and not unique. Also, 4 builds take significantly longer than having just 1 build. What would you do? Is there a best way or just preference in time? Do I give up a lot if I sacrifice specifics and go for speed instead? So I will start by saying, in general, for basically the reasons you've outlined, I vastly prefer building everything together. So you can see, even for my contest portfolio for baseball here tonight, right? I've got a mix of different contests. I would build this using a kind of middle ground set of sliders, or perhaps maybe sliders that fit the contest that I am most heavily invested into, and build that way. And the advantages you get of building everything together is that you get a unique lineup into every contest. You can make sure that you have a unique lineup in every contest. But 2, and probably the more important one, is you get a much more efficient build process. You have to do 1 build. You can manage all of your exposures and things like that from that 1 build. And handle things that way, right? So that's the big advantage to grouping things together. Now, the sacrifice, what you stand to potentially give up, is you may build lineups that are not perfectly built on the perfectly optimal settings or sliders for all those individual different contests, right? You may play, if you build with these sliders, you may have a contest, or you may have a lineup that fades ownership and is a little more highly variant than it needs to be for a single entry. So there is a little bit of a trade-off there. If you have enough time and you want to build lineups that are perfectly optimized from a settings standpoint, and you're not as concerned about playing a unique lineup into every single contest, then it might make sense to split this up and to build all of your different builds separately. But I would probably say that best practice here for most cases is to pick a midpoint set of sliders or settings that fit kind of roughly the middle of all of these different contest types. I think across all sports, the 20 max 10 to 50K entrance is like a very good middle ground set of sliders. And build all of your lineups together so that you can build more quickly, more efficiently, and manage all of your exposures and things like that all in one place. So, and then there is a question here. I'm not going to copy all of this here. We'll copy here. We'll get most of this here. So one sec. Let's get this up here. And guys, give me a thumbs up here if I sound okay, if I look okay on screen here. Again, first stream here. The one thing I did, I moved up into the mountains here. I had to make a couple internet sacrifices here, so should have pretty good internet speed. Should be able to get through okay. But give me a thumbs up in chat. It's quiet over there in chat, so give me a thumbs up if everything looks and sounds okay here, since it's the first stream in the new dig. So anyway, this other question from Coach B said, second question, is there a best way to rank our entries? If you use your unique rank, would you have your best projected lineups fill for the biggest prize pool, for the highest entry fee, or one with the highest % chances of winning your money back? Is there a best way to rank the contest when filling your lineups? This is a really good question. Honestly, I have been using unique random most often. I am the difference between EV at different Saber scores for your top lineups, I think, is generally pretty low. I don't think there's a massive difference between your first lineup and your 150th lineup. And I have been using unique random just to get a very flat exposure across all of those different lineups, right? Like, let me put this another way. If I went in here and made an edit and said, well, I only want 10% Skewball tonight, probably all of my first lineups here are going to have Skewball in them, right? Because they're all the highest, like a ton of, well, it actually doesn't look like that's the case, but the vast majority of the first few lineups in my pool are going to have Skewball because I'm limiting his exposure. And when you fill with unique random, you will get a more flat, even exposure to all these different players across all of your different lineups. You won't be overly exposed to one player in the lineups as you fill with unique rank. If you want to value SaberScore highly and you want to kind of figure out what's the best way to rank and sort your entries, what I would probably do, and what I've done in the past, is I've just sorted by buy-in. So I'll sort like this and then use the unique rank, and that will fill my number one SaberScore lineup into my highest buy-in contest. I think that works pretty good. I think that's at least a pretty decent approximation of the contest you most badly, like a combination of the contests that you kind of have the best chances of winning, and also want to win the most. Another option would be to do just prize pool. You can do that typically pretty efficiently by sorting by name. It won't get you exactly there, but it does a pretty decent job. And then you can drag and drop to get the rest of the way there. So, you can do, I guess it actually didn't really seem to do that well at all, but you can drag and drop and do by prize pool. And I think that's also a decent way. So you would put, your best lineups in your highest prize pool contests. So I would do something like this, right? Let's see. Something like that, right? So you could do a prize pool sort as well. And then, I want to win the contest the most where there's the most amount of money to win. I think that would also work fine. Again, I probably wouldn't sweat this so much, because in reality, when it comes down to it, if even through your first 300 lineups, I don't think there's going to be a ton of difference in theoretical EV between where those of your first overall lineup and your 300th best lineup. And you can probably I think unique random works totally fine. Long story short, that's what I do most often. But if you want to use unique rank, I would sort by buy-in or prize pool. It's probably the easiest. Or just what contest you want to win the most, right? Like what is it? Maybe it's the biggest prize to first. A lot of different ways to do that. So, All right. Looks like everybody says things are looking good. So that's awesome. Really happy to hear that. That is great. So, all right, let's keep it going. We got a lot to get to. A lot of questions here. We got a good pace so far here today. So let's go ahead and answer a question from Tone here. And this one says, I've started incorporating stack rules into my process. Previously, I always trusted the SaberSim correlation to give me stacks, mainly because I'm not interested in the smaller stacked lineups, 3-3-2, just as an example. And sometimes default SaberSim will give you some of those in your lineups. I would like to know what your recommendation is on the types of rules you personally would set. My first instinct was to go with a 4-2 rule, but after doing some research, I'm leaning towards a 5-2 rule. Would you lower your stacking rules on a smaller slate or just ride with your default rules no matter what the slate size? Yeah, good question. So I also do generally use some stacking rules to kind of help get me to where I want to be. I'm similar. I don't really change the correlation slider, but I have a certain amount of control I want in my stacks. There's certain stack sizes that I want to see. I would edit them as exposures in the post build process anyway, so I might as well just set a stacking rule. I would say, so I break it up a little bit by slate size. If it's 5 games or less, I pretty much don't care what stacks I get. I will play, like, maybe I want at least 3 players from the same team, but I will play basically whatever stack SaberSim says is appropriate for a 5 game or less slate. So any of those small slates, I don't care. Whatever I get. For the medium-sized slates, like 6 to, I would say, about 10, I call a medium-sized slate. The main thing I just want to do is I want to make sure that I have at least 4 players from the same team. I don't, again, same thing that you've mentioned here. I don't really want to play a lot of 3-3-2s, even though I kind of get why they exist. I'm not a big fan of the 3-3s either. Sometimes you may even get smaller stack sizes than that. I'm just not that interested in those. I would cross them off in the post-build phase. So I typically just set this kind of stack rule. You will find, for a while, I was doing this and doing exactly what you said here, where you do at least 4 and at least 2. But since you're leaving the correlation slider on anyway, for the most part, I've found that you don't actually need that extra rule. You don't need the at least 2 players, because the correlation slider will generally make sure that you get, like, if you set a rule like this, you'll get mostly 5 3s, 5 2s, 4 4s. 4 3s, that kind of thing, without having to set this additional rule. And this additional rule just makes the builder take longer. I've noticed that. On FanDuel, same thing. If you set at least 4, the correlation slider takes care of the rest. You don't really need to set the additional rule. On a big slate like we have tonight, I sometimes will start getting even more specific than that. It kind of depends on the slate. Personally, what I end up doing, there are situations where I have set a rule where I just say I want to play as correlated as possible, and I will just say give me only 5 3s and only 4 4s on FanDuel. There are other times where I will go in and set a rule, that says at least 4 players from the same team, and then I will go through in the post build process and select only 5 3s, 5 2s, 4 3s, and 4 4s. For example, and that's for the really big slates. So it does depend a little bit on the slate size. I do like setting stacking rules, and even, I guess, even a more general way of saying this is I really like anytime you have something, if you know you are going to do something in the post-build process, I like the idea of instead setting that up ahead of time in the pre-build process, because it will just mean you have a better set of lineups to work with after the lineups have been built, right? That's basically why I do this, is I know that I'm going to eliminate 3 stacks anyway in the post-build process. And I would rather just make sure I only have 4 stacks to begin with, so that when I'm making other changes in the build screen, I'm still getting the best lineups possible. I'm not just eliminating, a random 250, 300 lineup set from my pool right out of the gate that I knew I never wanted to begin with. So that is not to say that this is objectively the best strategy. I would happily be talked into why 3-3-2 stacks are actually good to play. But for right now, I prefer just, I think there's a lot of different lineups out there that you can make, trillions of lineups probably on a 13 game slate like we have here tonight. So I will just prefer to play the ones that have a little bit of a bigger stack, maximize some of that correlation, because I think there's plenty of lineups that have those really big stacks in them that are profitable. So That's my approach. Good question. Okay, and then this is a quick one and a good one from Mr. T here. And this is something that we recently added, or not so much recently, but we added in the last year, I think, and it was really annoying when we didn't have this. So I'm glad it's here now. So the question says, when you're trimming your player pool of players prior to a build, that's almost a tongue twister. Pool of players prior to a build. Is there a way to get rid of the players so that they're no longer visible instead of just being grayed out? It would be good to just sort through the players you plan to use for a slate without viewing the undesirables. Wow, undesirables is a good word for that context here. Yes, there is a way to do this. And again, there didn't used to be. So, one of the things I used to try to do all the time, I like a lot of times when I first sit down to study a slate, I'll look at the pitchers by salary. This used to be so painful. Because it would show everybody, even all these guys that are on the IL. This little icon in the upper right, hide removed players, will now give you a very, very clean presentation and only show you players that are in your player pool, that aren't filtered out, that have a projection, and so on. So yes, you can do that. Okay. Then we get to a question from Edward here, and I was a little bit confused on this. So I actually think this is, I know your name is Edward in Slack, but you always sign your messages Ed. So I think it's Ed here. But Ed, if you are here, I have a couple questions for you. So he said, I was thinking about using the research builds using 10 sim variants. I understand that uses a single sim for each lineup. Yes, it does. And you can now see that here, by the way, if you hover, average projection of 1 sim per lineup. But the question says, my question is that if there are 2,000 sims for each game, I would think that there would be 2,000 different outcomes. If a single sim is used, isn't it just as likely as it picks the 2,000th ranked sim as the first ranked sim? How does this mesh with the idea that we get an optimum lineup from the research builds? Maybe thinking too much, but I've wondered about this for a while. So I think what I'm confused about here with this question is, what do you mean by 2,000th ranked sim versus the first ranked sim? And let me kind of, I guess I will kind of maybe go a step further and explain this a little bit more. Let's do NBA. Do we have projections for NBA yet? Yeah, we do. So let's do NBA because it's a good example where this actually really applies, right? So if you're building lineups for NBA, correlation and ownership fade are off and sim precision is 10, right? So what's actually happening here is we're going to basically take 500 game simulations, right? And build the optimal lineup. What is literally the highest scoring lineup you can make for that individual game simulation, right? And as game simulations, right, as purely just sims, those don't really have a ranking, right? Like I don't really know what the 2,000th ranked sim means versus the first ranked sims. The sims don't have rankings, right? The sims are just what they are, right? We select for them randomly, and then we build the optimal lineup for 500 different sims, and then now we rank these, right? So we rank this by SaberScore, right? So what's happening here now is it's saying, okay, so we built 500. Here are the best 20 ranked by SaberScore. And I know Neil had a follow-up question here, so I'll just answer this now. So SaberScore, when you're building at a 0-0-10 build, is just what was the highest scoring lineup by actual scoring points in that sim, right? When correlation and ownership fade are off, right? What was literally the highest scoring lineup? There's another component added to this. If this lineup is optimal for more than one game simulation, it gets a SaberScore boost. So there's another component there. But it is mostly, I would say it is like predominantly speaking, the way of thinking about this. It is mostly what was the highest scoring individual sim. So in that way, there's a ranking here. But I guess I'm still kind of confused on what the rest of the question is here. So maybe a little bit more context. I guess from the standpoint of a research build, right? Part of the reason why we look at the entire pool in a research build is because we don't really care about the rankings, right? We're just trying to figure out, how often does a player show up in the optimal lineup, not how high scoring is that optimal lineup when it's optimal. for the purposes of a research build. So for a research build, that's why I build, I'll go in here and I'll do 1,500 and look at as many lineups as possible, because I'm just trying to look basically at the sims directly. I don't care about the rankings in that way. So, Ed, if you're around, give me a little bit more context. Okay. So he says he's here. Let me know if that kind of helps to get at least started. If you have more follow-up questions, or if you can maybe explain a little bit more of what you're thinking there, I'm happy to dive back in here. I'll come around back to that towards the end of the stream here today if you have more for me. But I think kind of the main point is like this. So the sims start first, right? We have the sims, and they don't have rankings, right? Those are literally like game scripts. They're literally like play-by-play scripts of how a game could play out. And then we can build a lineup based on the stat line that each player scores in those sims. And then we can build an optimal lineup and say, this is the best possible lineup that you could have built for that sim. And then once the lineups exist and we assign fantasy points to that, then we can rank them. And we are literally ranking them by which ones are the highest scoring and which lineups are the most likely to be optimal. But it's really only once that jump is made from a game sim to a lineup that we can actually rank it. So anyway, I hope that at least gets the conversation started. Happy to come back and talk about this a little bit more. Neil, if Neil's around here, I kind of answered your question along with Ed's here. If you have more questions on that, let me know. But again, SaberScore for a 0-0-10 build is basically just how many fantasy points did that lineup score in the individual sim it represents. We'll hit another quick one here. Biggie had asked about these stacking rule limitations here. Let me go ahead and get this message pulled off. Let's see. So there was a question about like right now at the moment, and this is just a bug. You can't make, you can make a set of rules that looks like this, right? Where you say at least 5 of Nationals or Diamondbacks and no more than 3 of Cincinnati and Miami, where this rule technically does not conflict and get an invalid stack message. This is something we're working on fixing. So I guess I didn't even really need to demo that on screen. But Biggie, if you're here, we are working on fixing that. So Neil, follow up here, said, thanks, Jordan. I'm mostly thinking about it from a Showdown perspective and wondering if SaberScore is a good way to sort Showdown lineups. I think it is a fantastic way to sort Showdown lineups because because both of the things that are going into that sorting are really valuable for Showdown, right? So, if a lineup is optimal for a variety of different ways that a game could play out, right? That would be a good reason to play that lineup in Showdown. Right? Like let's say there's 10,000 sims for a game and one single lineup, just as an extreme example, is optimal for 100 of them, right? That would be probably a very good lineup to play once you start thinking about duplication and other things like that. But we would at least want, that would be a good lineup, right? And same thing kind of on the other side of the SaberScore, right? If there are all these different game scripts of the way that a game could play out, you don't really want to play the lineups that are the best on average, right? On average projections. You might as well play the ones that have extremely high scoring ceiling potential when that game script plays out. So yeah, I think SaberScore, I think Showdown is probably one of the more compelling use cases for SaberScore, period. Like especially comparing to NBA Classic, right? I don't think there's I think SaberScore is still valuable, and I think it's generally better than projected score. I don't know if the difference is as wide there as it is for something like Showdown. So, cool. Anyway, let's keep it going here. Let's answer some more questions. Interesting one here from Kino. And I see some questions starting to trickle in YouTube chat as well. I'm going to get us all caught up on the questions that came in over the weekend and yesterday, and then we'll jump into the live questions here. Kino said, what do you think about the 100-player leagues in terms of GPP selection? It pays top 12% on FanDuel with a somewhat top-heavy payout structure. In terms of variance and softness, would you recommend these tourneys over large field single-entry GPPs? If so, thoughts on ownership fade in these small GPPs? 3-entry max, only competing with 30 other guys. Should I go for 2 to 3 chalky stacks, or does fading still matter a lot? So, to be totally transparent here, we didn't really explore these 100-mans when we did our contest selection research that I was talking about here before the start of the stream, right? It wasn't really factored into what we looked at. So I'm going to answer this question kind of based on extrapolating what we learned from this research. And I do think when we come back to doing a little bit more contest selection research in the future, I think that would be an interesting place for us to go and actually take an analytical approach to these intuitively and as it fits into our new contest selection framework. I think for those elevator contests, those big ROI, those ROI booster kind of contests that we're focusing on trying to play like really soft opponents, I don't think those fit very well into that framework, because the goal of those is to, find soft competition, right? Like those are going to have somewhat friendly sizes. They're going to be smaller. They're going to be, you may win them at a higher rate because of the raw probability. You have a 3 in 100 chance of taking that contest down at a baseline, versus the daily dollar, you have a 1 in 3,500 chance of taking that down as a baseline. But because there's only, you mentioned it, 30 other people in that contest, and they're not particularly attractive contests to a more casual player, I think they're going to be kind of tough. I think your theoretical ROI is going to be kind of lower there. I am going to say, purely from an intuitive stance, I think you can do better for those ROI booster elevator type contests, as we've been calling them, than the 100-mans. But I would be very interested for us to do contest sims on those contests at some point, to actually back that up with some data. With that said, I think you are on the right track. I think those contests are generally so small that you essentially can ignore ownership. You are going to basically play. You'll still want to correlate your lineups to play like high upside constructions. I think allowing a little bit of variance into your lineup pool by having sim precision at like 1 or even 2 is still good. But ownership, might be 0, 1, or 2, but it's very low. It's essentially ignored, right? Even if there's a 40% owned guy in a contest like that, right? That means there's only 40 unique lineups that you are competing against in that pool, right? Whereas, a 40% owned guy in a 10,000 person contest, right? There are way more unique lineups that have that player. You gain way more out of fading that player in terms of lineups that you no longer have to contend with if that player fails than in a super small contest. So I generally, a lot of times when you start talking about 100-man fields or smaller, I would say I virtually ignore ownership at that point, personally. So good question. Okay, cool. Let's keep it going here. Question from Dwayne. And he said, I know you do 0010 research builds, but what does a 000 build do? Does it give you the chalkiest build since there's no sim precision? Pretty close. What it actually does is it builds basically the best overall lineups using the average projections. It essentially builds cash lineups is what it does. So it uses these projections for every single lineup and then builds you literally the highest scoring average projected lineups possible. So if we build this here, it will say, using the average projections, what are the lineups that maximize average projected score, which are generally good cash lineups. Average projections are not indicative of upside. They ignore ranges of outcomes of players. They ignore correlation. They ignore ownership projections, all kinds of stuff like that, right? That is why the sliders exist. So when you turn them off, you get cash lineups. You get highly average projected lineups. I think a cash build can be a decent tool as a way to get an idea of what popular constructions might look like. As you mentioned here, I think they will generally be, I don't know if they will be the chalkiest builds as possible, but they will definitely be some of the chalkiest builds possible. In fact, before our updates to the ownership projections this past year, I actually used to do builds like this a lot to get an idea of what our what I thought might be the chalk on that particular slate. Since the start of this baseball season, really actually even the last basketball season, we've put a lot of work into our ownership models, and I don't even think you really need to do it anymore. If you want to know what are going to be the chalkiest pitchers, I think you can pretty much just get away with actually using just the ownership projections and saying, oh, yep, there's the pitching chalk, right? Looks like a pay up night at pitching to me tonight. I'm sure there's some cheaper stacks that are going to be popular as a result of that. So they're a little weird right now because, again, I think this game isn't correct, but we'll get that worked out. All right. Mr. T had said that he couldn't see that button on okay, so it should be right here, Mr. T, in that gear. So it makes sense. It is a little hard to find there, but it's right here. If you want to show or hide exclude players. So and it probably, let's see, iPad. Yeah, should be the same. So okay, and then what else? We had a couple other questions trickle in here. Dwayne said, I was thinking about doing this for NBA Showdown, so I was curious. Thank you. I love that for NBA Showdown. Now, I don't know if it would, again, I think I would use it in conjunction with the ownership projections as they are, right? Like the ownership projections are going to tell you, or you're going to do a great deal of getting you there, right? Of telling you, this is going to be popular. But you can take kind of one step further of, actually seeing potentially chalky lineups. Yeah, I like the idea of doing a build like this to study what are going to be really popular constructions for Showdown. So good idea. I love that. Okay, and then let's get this follow-up here. This is from Ed again, and then we'll hop over to YouTube chat here. He said, maybe another way to look at it, if there are 100 people doing 0-0-10 research builds, because of the single sims, because of the different single sims, each of the 100 gets a distinct set of optimal lineups. I wanted to make sure my thinking is in the right direction. Yeah, so I think really, kind of what I'm getting here, even if you build 1,500, right? Like you're not of the actual however many different ways a game could play out, right? There's actually like probably an infinite number of ways that a game could play out. Your sampling of 1,500 optimal simulations is really just a very small subsample at the end of the day. You're not ever actually going to get, it's an approximation, right? You're basically saying, if I take a 1,500 slate simulation sample of the way that this entire slate could play out, it will approximate what the entire range of outcomes of the way that a slate could play out actually is. And it works okay for that purposes. It's better than what other people have, but it's not perfect, right? I don't know if anybody listened to Lulz last week with Nerdy Tender, but he actually he had an analogy of saying that, there are these old rake-free poker machines in Vegas, right? That you can play rake free, that have a pretty outdated model for how the computers play poker, but they're so much better than humans, right? That it doesn't really matter that the model sucks, basically. I think research builds in some ways kind of have some similarities there where, yeah, 1,500 sims of a slate in the grand scheme of things is probably actually pretty small. But it's such a better approximation of determining what the actual probabilities of a player showing up in the winning lineup for a slate actually is, that I think it's still really effective, personally. So, Ed, I hope that kind of is helping to answer your question. I might still be a little bit lost here. Oh, I think I missed a comment. He said, you say each game is simmed, say 2,000 times, so there are 2,000 available. How do I know I'm getting a good one in a 0-0-10 build? So I guess actually, okay, so talking about that. So again, I don't think there are good and bad sims, like in the same way, like, so for game 2, right? Like game 2 of the NBA Finals, was that a good or a bad sim? Right? Do you see kind of why that I don't think that question is even the right way to look at it, right? The sims themselves are not opinionated. There are not good or bad sims. The sims, individual sims, are just a way that the game could play out. And if that was the outcome of what actually happened, then building the optimal for that set of sims, for that sim, would be great. That would be very profitable, right? And every simulation combined together of all of the sims we have for a game represents, in theory, the full range of outcomes of the way that that game could play out, right? Like, let's say there's some game here. So let's look at like Tatum, right? So, let's say there's some game where Tatum scores 58 points, right? That's not really a good sim or a bad one, right? That just is that outcome. And we can build a lineup then that is optimal for that outcome, right? Now that lineup can be good or bad depending on a lot of other context, right? Like, I don't even want to say that lineup can be good or bad, right? That lineup may be positive EV or negative EV based on other factors. Let's say for some reason you knew that 50% of the field in a contest was all going to play that lineup, right? Maybe you had some insider info and 50% of the field is going to play this lineup. Well, that lineup may now not be a good one to play because it is negative expected value in that contest. But it is still the optimal lineup for that sim, right? The sim didn't do anything wrong. The sim is not bad or good, right? The sim is just what it is, and that's the optimal lineup for that sim. So, I think maybe the difference here is that, lineups can be profitable or unprofitable based on the contest that they're played into and the other, context of that situation. But sims themselves are unopinionated. They're agnostic. They are not good ones or bad ones within the whole. So, again, I hope that kind of helps. Maybe shed a little bit more light on this. Again, we can go back and forth here, talk about this in a little bit more detail if there's more questions. I am pretty confident I'm still missing kind of something here, but we can come back to this. So let's go ahead and jump over to YouTube chat here and hit a couple more here. Let's see. Getting caught up. I just want to make sure I don't miss anything. Aaron said, do you still sort by projected score for your entries? Generally, no. I think SaberScore is better for most applications. Especially in high correlation sports, right? Like the main thing in something like baseball that you're going to lose by sorting by projected scores, you're no longer going to prioritize the higher correlated lineups. You're going to get smaller stacks, less stacks. So I think I would, there are different processes for people that maybe might lead you to using projected score, but I wouldn't just, if you ask me, all else being equal, should I use SaberScore or should I use projected score? What is better? I would say use SaberScore because SaberScore was invented because projected score has big limitations. Now, that doesn't mean, you could probably describe to me a process where you say, hey, well, I do this and I do this and I do this. And at the end, I sort by projected score because I want to prioritize my projections above all else. I'm sure there's a process that fits that, but all else being equal, SaberScore is probably better. So, okay. Richie said, question about chalk on small slates. Last week, there was a 2-game slate, Washington versus Miami and San Francisco versus someone else. I forget. Chaz Chisholm was 88% owned. And after running test builds, he was very likely to be optimal. He ended up scoring 0, but the winning lineup still rostered him. In this situation, are you hurting yourself fading someone like him on a small slate single entry? Probably not. I mean, it kind of, there's kind of a lot to unpack here. And it's always interesting going back to these individual like slates and trying to provide best practice. I would say, all hitters, most hitting charts generally look like this, where the most common outcomes are very, very low. And in fact, Jazz's outcome graph on that particular slate, his most likely outcome may very well have been scoring 0 points, right? Like that, the outcome that actually occurred may have been the most likely one. Now, with that said, if there's a 2-game slate, there's only a few players at every position to play, and there's only a few players that are going to there's only even a few different players that you can spend salary on, and you have to get upside somewhere. I would say, I would probably be unlikely to play a 88% owned hitter on a 2-game slate if I could avoid it in a single entry contest for that reason entirely, just because, you get so much leverage by not having him in your lineups. But I don't know if I would, I can't say that is something I would also do 100% of the time as a heuristic, I guess, is what I'm saying. Right. So yeah, follow-up question, or is 88% ownership, is it more favorable to fade? I'm always curious about chalk on small slates and single entries. Here, let's do a quick experiment and see what we get out of this. So let's look at this. So we have this 2-game turbo slate, and we are projecting 52.18% Dalton Varsho, right? Let's run our research build and see, how this looks. I'm just curious, how often does he actually show up in the optimal? But my guess is that he's probably a fade, most likely. So I find it hard to believe that a single player has that high of a percent chance, and 88% is crazy, right? That's crazy. That's very high for a hitter on any slate. But again, 2-game slates, it gets weird because sometimes there's not a lot of other places to put that salary or to other players to use in that spot. If the positional eligibility is weird, right? There could be 2-game slates where maybe there's only only two guys you can use there. So we say Varsho has roughly a 1 in 3 chance of being in the optimal lineup, and he's going to be 52% owned, right? He is one of the best. He is the single best fade, according to negative leverage here on this little 2-gamer slate. And you can see, right, a guy like Ruiz, there's a ton of positive leverage by just basically playing Ruiz instead of playing Varsho for this 2-gamer. So yeah, I would say, in general, even in single entries, I'm likely to fade those extremely highly owned hitters on small slates. Daniel said, still trying to learn the ways to play DFS positive EV. I'm wondering why we still want to get players in stacks, even if they are over-owned by the field. Wouldn't it be minus EV to own them at all? So ultimately, a player or a stack has no EV, right? There is nothing, even just using this example that we just gave, Dalton Varsho is not a negative EV play. There are lineups of all, I would say a better way of thinking about it, of all of the possible lineups you could play with Dalton Varsho, probably most of them are minus EV, right? Lineups entered into a specific contest has an expected value, right? That's literally what that means. There is a payout structure to that contest. That lineup has a probability of reaching each of those different payout positions. And you could literally, if you knew what those were, those probabilities exactly, you could calculate expected value exactly. But you can only do that at the lineup level, right? And, you can kind of reason through that in your head pretty quickly, right? EV is literally all of the profitable outcomes times the sum of all profitable outcomes times the probability of that happening, minus the sum of all negative outcomes times the probabilities of those happening. That is literally the definition of expected value. So you can see very quickly, what is the expected value of putting Dalton Varsho in a lineup or of Dalton Varsho, right? That doesn't really make sense, right? So the point I'm making here is that you can take a stand and say, for example, that I am going to completely fade Varsho in 150 lineups, just as an example, because I want to maximize my EV. And that makes some sense because a lot of lineups that have Dalton Varsho are going to be negative EV, and you can give yourself a better chance at maximizing the EV of your entire lineup portfolio by fading completely. But that doesn't necessarily mean that no lineup with Dalton Varsho is plus EV. And in a very big slate where you have a ton of options, it might be the easiest route to say, I'm going to take all of the players that I think are the most overowned by the field and fade them completely. Because when I fade them, like let's think about it for stacks tonight, right? There are 26 teams on the slate tonight, 13 games, right? So I'm going to fade the 3 stacks that I think are going to be the most overowned by the field, because even if I do that, there are 23 other teams I can pick from. But if there were only 4 games on the slate, right? Well, now there's only 8 teams playing total. And by fading 4 of them, or 3 of them, by fading 3 of them, you're leaving only 5 left, right? And you may be sacrificing, there are still good positive EV lineups that include those highly, maybe over-owned stacks. They may just have very low-owned pitchers or very low-owned one-offs or something like that, right? You may be sacrificing too much at that point to completely fade those teams, right? Or if you could perfectly, chart EV of all of the lineups in the pool, maybe some of those lineups still are very high positive EV. So ultimately, right, it's important to remember that I think kind of 2 things here. One is that lineups have expected values, but players and stacks themselves don't. Right there, you may say that you may say Toronto is the most overowned stack tonight, and still be able to come up with 100 different Toronto lineups that were plus EV if you could exactly perfectly calculate EV. I think it can be okay to just eliminate all players. I think it could be okay to eliminate all players in the field that were theoretically overowned if it was a massive slate, but at some point you need to put players in lineups. And the smaller the slate gets, the less players you have to work with. So that is why, that's a good example of maybe you might identify a player that if you identify a player that's overowned, maybe you want to be half the field instead of fading them completely. Right. As an example. So let me know if that helps. This is kind of a tough question. It's a tricky one. I think there's a lot to unpack here. So let me know if that kind of helps there. If you have any follow-up questions, happy to jump back into that for sure. Patrick says, when do you consider a true overlay GPP contest? Lots of people always get that overlay definition confused. Yeah, I was one of those people, at least as of recently. I am learning, or I have learned recently, overlay strictly refers to a contest where basically DraftKings or any of the sites is having to put money into that contest to pay it off, right? To fill the prize pool. So a contest that, I guess in a basic way. So if you have the relay throw, right? If for this contest to properly overlay, it has to fail to fill to at least 85%, right? Basically, there's 15% rake. DraftKings would have to be paying some of the actual prize pool money into this contest. No matter what, though, if a contest doesn't fill, it's ultimately always good for you. Right? Even if it fills to 95%, right? You're at that point, you're playing a rake reduced contest because they're still having to give up some of the rake that they would have been taking. But proper overlay is when the site is actually having to pay into the prize pool to pay out all those prizes. So I think this is mostly a semantical question rather than a practical question. On a practical standpoint, it is always good. It is always in the player's favor when a contest fails to fill, at least in the micro level on that particular slate. There's a macro question of if your favorite sport is failing to fill its contests every week, baseball sometimes makes me a little concerned in that way. That doesn't bode necessarily that well for that sport. But on the micro level, it's always good if a contest doesn't fill for you. Glenn says, how often does ownership update again? I think it's once an hour throughout the day. In the final hour before lock, ownership will rebuild. Ownership will rebuild every time a sim runs that changes projections once our other inputs to ownership also update. So when there are delays to ownership updating prior to lock, it is because we are waiting basically for one of our other sources to update we use an industry aggregate projection to build ownership projections, and our sims and projections update really fast. We beat most of the other sites out there to the punch sometimes, and that means sometimes we are waiting for their projections to update to rebuild our own ownership. So, but it is basically every, I think actually specifically it's every 5 minutes if a sim has run upon updating of the other projections that fill out that model. So should be pretty fast. Matt says, when the new contest selection principles info, how might you apply these to Yahoo for how different their contests are? Good question. Let's go check out Yahoo. I would say the principles should still work. Do they even have, what do the baseball contests look like on Yahoo? So let's see. So what I would probably do is I would still start with, okay, let's see. Let's see. Why doesn't there let's do guaranteed only. Oh man, interesting. So this is interesting. I would probably say there's not really a big, at least for baseball. Football is probably different, and maybe even basketball, but these contests are just like in general pretty small. That I think it might just be in your favor to just fill, like to basically find the contest, to basically fill the large field GPPs in order of smallest entry fee to largest, right? To get as many lineups in play as possible. There's not, I don't even, like, they don't really even have like interesting single entry GPPs here, right? So like, I guess what I'm saying is I don't know if there's not really the diversifier versus elevator difference here on Yahoo. Yeah, I might have to think about this a little bit more, and maybe I'll get back to you with like a better answer after I've had a chance to think a little bit more. So what I would probably do is I would probably still kind of try to spread out into different contests so that you're still contest diversified, right? Like let's just say, for example, right? Let's say you put, all of your entries into this 50 cent, right? Well, if there is an elite lineup that just happens to be entered into that contest, right? Your ceiling of all of those lineups just immediately goes down, right? Your ability to win that contest goes down significantly just by bad luck, right? There's some value in diversifying from a contest standpoint, not just from a lineup standpoint, or is actually a lot of value from diversifying from a contest standpoint. So I'll have to think about this a little bit more. I might run this by Eric too and just see what he thinks. Like my impression would be here's what my impression is. I would probably take what my bankroll allocation is, and I would fill contests from smallest entry fee to largest, focusing mostly on the larger field stuff. So like stuff over 1,000 total entrants. And do something like set some kind of heuristic and say, maybe I'm only going to play 50% of my total allocation max in any given contest. So if I was playing $100, maybe I would only play, I would probably max this 68 entries here. And then maybe I'd play like some of the $1 here. Oh, so I mean, maybe I would just be maxing these because they're smaller than I thought, but you kind of get the idea here. So yeah, I don't know, but I want to think about that a little bit more. I think I'm going to have to think about that a little bit more. So Patrick said, going forward, do we just avoid weather delay games in MLB? Yesterday, we almost had the Royals game postponed with no bad weather in the forecast. Cincy game had the highest probability of postponed, but then the Guardians game was postponed. Yeah, I didn't play yesterday, but it sounded like a bit of a weather mess. Yeah, it sounded like it wasn't a fun one. Honestly, it's a part of the game with baseball. I think in general, I like to play pretty conservatively when I think about when I think about handling weather, and mostly that's just because of the intuition I've gained from my research builds. Right, like if we, let's run this real quick. Right, like when you run a lot of these builds every single day and you start to get familiar with these probabilities, you will realize how low the chance of any given team actually being the optimal team on that slate is, right? No matter how juicy that matchup looks, right? The Blue Jays tonight, right? I think like the highest implied run total team at the moment probably have like a 10% chance of being the highest overall stack. So it makes it easier when you know that to fade games that have risk. A lot of it still is going to be a personal risk tolerance thing, right? Like let's go check that the Roto Grinders dashboard here and see, right? See what the weather looks like for tonight. Okay, so we have an orange game here, right? Chicago at Baltimore. And I'm sure Kevin Roth will update this later in the day. But there's weather risk in this game, right? Like this game could get postponed. There is risk there, right? I mean, weather's unpredictable. There's even risk in maybe some of these other games. Typically for me, anything that starts with orange here on Kevin Roth's dashboard, I really, really start considering fading it. And sometimes it doesn't work out in your favor, right? Sometimes the game that, I know yesterday the Reds scored a bunch of runs and that was a game that was ranked orange and would have been really risky. And I probably would have faded that game. And sometimes you get hosed. Like sometimes it just doesn't work out. Other times a game is yellow or yellow-green and it all looks good. And then the wrong storm pops in the wrong spot and a team doesn't want to play that day and they postpone the game and you just get hosed, right? That happens to everyone. I think you can kind of maximize your advantage of dealing with this in a way that you are likely to be on the better side of this more often than not, is to be conservative with weather situations here, and lean on the side of fading. Like let's look at this here tonight. So let's say here let's just look at this, right? Okay. So the best overall team on the slate is Toronto, who has an 11.2% chance of being the highest owned stack, right? Now, if you build lineups with SaberSim, you're probably going to get a lot of Toronto. And let's say that game had terrible weather, right? It has pretty good weather. But let's say it did have high weather and it looks like there is a chance for a little bit of rain here. So let's say this gets worse and this becomes an orange rated game, right? According to they are the best projected team on the slate, but they only have an 11% chance of being in the optimal lineup, right? Or actually, let's look at the full pool. It's probably even worse. What is it actually? It is a 8% chance of being in the optimal lineup, right? Just fade it. Like who cares? Just go a different direction. And that's not to say, everybody that plays baseball DFS eventually gets screwed by weather. It just happens. There's no way around it. But you can maximize the probability of it working out in your favor by, I think, just kind of following a couple sharp strategies. So Metal Alloy said, I know this is a matter of personal preference, but how many teams for full stacks do you tend to focus on a slate as large as today? I struggle to find the right balance to take a stand and avoid spreading myself too thin. Yeah, this question comes in a lot, and I don't have a good answer for you, right? And I think the main reason why is because it misses a lot of context of a particular slate, right? I think 13 game slates, for example, put it another way, are more different from each other than similar, right? I don't know if they can be really grouped in a way of saying, that I always focus on this many stacks or this many teams for a slate of this size. Also, that doesn't take into account contests at all or number of lineups, right? Like I'll have a very different number in mind if I'm playing a 20 max tournament versus a 150 max tournament versus a 3 max, right? I would say in general, the sim precision slider is going to have the greatest impact on how many teams you are getting exposure to. And that slider has been back tested and set to its default value for different contest sizes and slate sizes. I think if you are unsure of how many teams to focus on, letting that slider help guide you is a good way to go, right? So if you're playing the 4-seamer, for example, right? Well, the sim precision slider is going to be at 5 by default for that contest. And the number of different stacks you are getting exposure to in this portfolio of 20 lineups is going to be, at least on average, a pretty good starting point. That makes sense for that particular slate. I really can't give you anything more than that. I don't think there's a number that comes to mind, even for 20 lineups or for 150 lineups for a 13-game slate. And even if I think I could tell you, if I said, hey, for a 13-game slate, stack 13 teams, 12 teams, 20 teams, I don't even know if that would actually make you a better player. So I would say allow the default sim precision slider to push you in the right direction that makes sense for that particular slate. And we'll see. Let's see. For 20 lineups, 13-game slate, sim precision at 5, we are getting exposure to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 teams. So for what it is worth, in baseball in particular, I play a pretty diversified style. I often end up, if I was playing this, right? So at probably right off the bat, I probably would not want this much exposure of Colorado stacks, especially against Rodon. So I would probably diversify from here by setting some max exposures to these highest owned teams and maybe come down to like 30% here and do something like that. And that likely will lead me to being more diversified than the default option. So I might be at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Then that's, I think, a general trend just for me because of the style of baseball DFS I like to play. I would probably be more diversified than default. So, Glenn, I don't even actually know the answer to how many other projection models are included there. So I don't know. And I don't even think it's entirely just other models included there. There's other layers to the ownership. Basically, our goal is trying to mimic the way that the field actually thinks about the slate. So I don't think it's just like going out to a bunch of other sites and pulling, like there's more going on behind the scenes there. But they other projection systems are an input to the ownership model. So they do impact the speed at which the ownerships can update prior to lock. But they are not the only thing in there. And I don't know the answer to how many there are. So Jose said, is it more beneficial to do a 1,500 pool instead of 500 for my 20 lineups in NBA DFS? I would say generally you probably don't need 1,500 for 20 lineups in NBA. But there is nothing wrong with doing 1,500. It just takes a little longer. It gives you a bigger pool to work from if you're setting a lot of exposures and editing a lot in the post-build screen. But for just 20 lineups, you probably don't need to do 1,500. You're probably not getting a lot out of it, like above and beyond just having more lineups to work with. So, Cloaked Mistborn said, one question I do have when the SaberSim guys have time, why doesn't Late Swap have a pool? It will soon, is the short answer. And it's a pretty interesting technical problem to build that because you basically you need to it's very easy to just like take random buckets of sims and then build optimal lineups for that. But when you start restricting players from being in the lineups, when you start restricting players that have to be in the lineups and you have a much smaller pool to work with, it's a lot more of an intensive builder problem to basically make, I guess that's a better way of putting it. It's late swap is very time sensitive. It is very hard to build a late swap pool quickly and efficiently, but it is something that we really want to do. It is actually an extremely high priority. It is something that is coming. Let's see. There's some follow-up questions here. How exactly does it work? It seems sometimes it doesn't seem or can't seem to effectively build off my exposures and gets caught in this loop sometimes. I know late swap is extremely complicated. It just doesn't seem to be working correctly, or at least that's what it was for NBA or NFL. It's being very wonky for me. Sometimes I go to upload and there's issues on DK that give me errors. Okay. Since you mentioned NBA and NFL, we have made a pretty big update to the way that this all works here. So specifically what used to be difficult with late swap is you had to manage your exposures in the entry editor, and they weren't necessarily the same exposures that you had on the home screen, and they had to be inherited from a build. There was a lot that was confusing, right? Now late swap listens properly to these min and max exposures that are set on your projections tab. And one step even further, you can send your min and max exposures home from a build, right? So this should be way easier to do, right? So hypothetical situation, I've gone in, I've set some min and max exposures. Let's do a little bit more just so we have some other stuff here, right? And now let's make this a 150 max also. Okay. So we've got this. And now let's fill. Let's actually put these in our lineups. Okay. And now let's say we need to, oh wait, I need to download this to actually register that. Okay. Now we're good. Now let's say it's time to late swap, right? So basically what we need to do, we want to run a new, we want to basically export these exposures and use them in the late swap build. So what we'll do, we'll use the send button and send exposures back to the home screen. So I'm going to send those there. And then now I can go back to the projections tab. And if I needed to late swap, we'll see my min and max exposures are here. Now, if I run a late swap build, I can actually do this. So now I'm all set. And the late swap will follow the exposures from the home screen. So but that should work. Patrick, GiantSquid is a real person. I've met him. He's a cool guy. Said, how does a player like that manage lineups when they individually play a contest and play? I think a simple way of putting this is there are a lot more. I think when you're looking at contests at the end of the night, it is going to feel like sharp players are winning all the time because you are going to pick up more on when they win more than when they lose. But there are playing at that volume, there are big downswings. Just like when you play at small volume, there are downswings at a $1,000 bankroll. There are downswings if you have a $100,000 bankroll or $1 million bankroll. There are always downswings. It's a high variance game. So nobody's winning every single night. But he knows what he's doing. He's a skilled DFS player. But I do think it's an important note to make that, like, even if it feels that way, nobody's winning all the time. And in fact, the higher and higher volume you go, generally the lower and lower your ROI gets, right? Like somebody that has when they're playing lower stakes contests with a $10,000 bankroll playing $200 a night, they're 25% ROI, right? As that volume increases, the ROI actually comes down. And as the ROI comes down, the actual downswings get worse, right? Because you're playing against better and better competition as you go up in stakes most of the time. So, yeah, there are downswings up there. So, all right, let's see. Eric said, is there something coming in the future to better handle entering different types of contests in bulk? Single entry 20 max, I have to run different build types and enter each by drop down a timestamp. I tried the settings discussed recently and they don't maximize my earning potential from what I see. Yes, there is. We do want to make that better. A better way to say, maybe something like, here's all the contests I'm playing. Here's the settings I want for each contest, and then build all, right? Start all of these builds all at once. Might be one solution there. We've talked about a few different ways of how that might look, but yes, that is something we want to improve upon in the future. And then a little bit of follow-up from Mr. Cloaked here, just coming in, so maybe they've answered. I've noticed that SaberSim goes way over the field for high-owned stacks, even when fade is high. It's odd. I suppose they add more 7, 8, 9. previous small slates in the past week or so, it was giving me like 80% Atlanta, Houston, Toronto stacks on a given night, even when they were all 30% owned on a 6-game slate. Maybe it was because they were giving me low-owned pitchers or low-owned mini stacks. Yeah, I mean, so again, I think this does kind of go back. Yeah, I know this. I mean, this goes back well to Daniel's question here of what's happening with ownership fade. Basically, is we will take each player on the slate, take what they scored in the individual set of simulations that were used to build that lineup, right? And then compare their, basically adjust players that are owned higher than average at their position down to fade the ownership, and adjust players that are owned less than their average player at the position up to promote playing low owned plays. But that doesn't necessarily mean there are no lineups with the chalkiest stack on the night, even at a high ownership fade, that are profitable. So that you can add additional value by adjusting exposures or fading them on your own in the post build process. But our goal is not to just turbo fade ownership. It is to give you an ownership adjusted portfolio of lineups that's appropriate for the slate. So, but Metal Alloy said, do you sacrifice anything by increasing the amount of uniques in your lineup? Interesting question. If you, yeah, I mean, by definition, yes, you do. Right? Because you are saying, you know, let's say you could calculate EV exactly, and you have lineup 1, and that's the highest EV lineup you can play. And if lineup 2 is one player different than lineup 1, and the second highest EV lineup that you can play is one player different than lineup 1, well, setting min uniques equal to 2 would eliminate that lineup from your pool, and you would play a lineup that had a slightly lower EV to diversify. So yes, you do, in theory, sacrifice. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad thing. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should chase EV at all costs, right? There is a value to being diversified. You said trying to avoid clumping. There's a value to avoiding inter-lineup correlation like that, right? So the answer, I would say yes. By definition, you do sacrifice something, but maybe it's worth it for your particular your lineup portfolio to force another level of diversification there. Kind of up to you. I typically, on a practical level, I prefer to get additional diversification by increasing the sim precision slider as opposed to increasing the mid uniques. But if you specifically want to, I would say, increase or decrease the correlation, the inter-lineup correlation, right? The likelihood that when one lineup does well in your portfolio, other lineups are likely to do well and vice versa. I think that can be a decent tool to do that. That's why it's there. So, all right, cool. I think I got to everything here. Hour and 23 minutes here on the nose. That was a fun one. We talked about all kinds of stuff. Had all kinds of different questions here coming in today. We talked about ownership. We talked about some contest selection. We talked about lineup diversification. We talked a lot about swap tools, the quick swap and the late swap tools. We talked a little bit more about some like theory stuff, weather. We were all over the place. That was a fun one. It was a good one to come back to here. It was a good first stream in the new house. I think we'll go ahead and leave it there for today. A couple notes before we go. First of all, if you were tuning in here today and you don't already have a SaberSim subscription, we have a free 7-day trial on our site, SaberSim.com. If you use the trial in the past, we reset everybody's trial at the start of baseball season this year. So come check us out. You can get another free trial if you used it in the past year and want to check us out. We've added a ton of new features and new tools in even just the past couple months, but the past year just added a ton of new functionality. So I will be right back here again on stream tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern again for another episode of Office Hours. I am expecting to have Matt on later this week here, most likely on Thursday, to talk about a couple recent improvements that we have made to the builder and a couple improvements that we expect to go live this week. So I will build some anticipation there and not say anything more about that, but look forward to Matt joining us here towards the end of the week. Good luck on this slate here tonight. It is nice that we have 13 games and hopefully light on the weather issues, but we'll see how it goes. And I will talk to you guys all tomorrow. Until then, see ya.